Yeah, welcome everybody, both in here and on YouTube. So we are here today for book one of Agrippa's Occult Philosophy, condensed. Dave will pick it apart for us, tell us what's useful to a modern occultist or an occultist practitioner in general. The program. Dave will introduce himself however he would like to and the things he's working on. He'll introduce the presentation, then we'll get into the presentation. Dave will call the breaks. I think it will be maybe just like last time, every hour or so. At the very end we'll do another break, Q&A, discussion, and hang out in the lounge as usual.
I am Dave, the Magus, as it is on screen. On YouTube, I cover the mechanics behind ceremonial magic, occultism, esotericism, and I really look at occultism from a mechanics style perspective instead of philosophical or like historical like a lot of other YouTube channels, and I've been an occultist for multiple years, and one of my favorite books is Agrippa. That being said, so this is going to be covering the books of occult philosophy. So this is the first book of occult philosophy. Now, the three books of occult philosophy were written by Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa, and they were originally published around 1533 AD. These are a full three books on magic and occultism, and Agrippa was a very hermetic Catholic Christian, and he studied under the abbot Trithemius. Now, it's important to know Trithemius because I believe there was actually a talk about Trithemius the other day here. But Trithemius is notable for being he was one of the people that taught Agrippa Paracelsus, and Agrippa was a contemporary of Paracelsus. And so they're going to have a lot of stuff in common with what Trithemius is going to say, because Trithemius was a teacher of both Paracelsus and Agrippa. That being said, we will be talking only about Agrippa today. So, just to briefly summarize the three books, the first one is all about the natural world. This is going to be more occult grimoire physics textbook hybrid. We will get into what that means in a bit. The second book is going to be an excessive quantity of math. I really cannot understate how much math there is. There is a lot of math. There is so much math that the first, like, seven or eight chapters are dedicated entirely to the attributes of numbers associated with, like, various things. Like, the four elements get a section in the chapter on the number 4. So there's a lot of math in that entire book, which at some point in the future we will talk about. There's a lot of spirit math, like how math relates to spirits. There's also the first mentions of geomancy and astrology. And book 3, The Divine World, has spirits, more math, Kabbalah, and various weird things that Agrippa really didn't have time to put into anywhere else because they really wouldn't have fit, such as necromancy and the muses. I believe he also puts the different types of frenzy in there. That could be in book 1, though. It's been a little bit. So, Agrippa, when he wrote the first book, at least, and when he wrote all three books, but most specifically with the first one, he was not writing a grimoire. He wasn't writing something like the Lesser Keys of Solomon. He wasn't writing something like the Book of Oberon, if you're familiar with those. He wasn't writing something like the Drawing Spirits into Crystals that his mentor Trithemius wrote. He was writing a physics textbook for the unseen forces of the world. As such, he jumps between what modern occultists call solid occultism and, the essence of water is literally required for the formation of the soul tier stuff, because this is what they believed scientifically back in the day. There's a lot of scientific things that are listed in Agrippa that are actually debunked, which I will go over and explain when we get to them. Altogether, the three books are a set of physics textbooks on how to do magic. Should you read these front to back? Yes. Will this particular lecture cover everything in book 1? Due to the sheer density, no. This is just going to be think of this more like a highlights reel. This is more of a Cliff Notes version. This is the Spark Notes lecture on Agrippa, and it's still 3 hours long. Or at least the first one was. We will see about this one. So, here's how this presentation is structured. These books are long. Book 1 is the longest. Book 1 is 247 pages long. And most, if not all of the information, like most of it, is not useful. 90% of the information to occult practices is not useful. Magnets disrupt, diamonds disrupting magnets is brought up, and there's a passage about how prostitutes cannot grow olives. I am not making either of these things up. They are both in Agrippa. As such, this will be more of a highlights reel, as I just mentioned. I will try to give a short summary of the chapters I'm skipping over, and if anyone has any questions, I can just literally pull up the book if we need to, because I do have the book right next to me for questions like that, which I did not have in the first lecture. So, the intro to the book. This is where we first mention the concept of virtue that flows from the archetypal Most High God into angels, the stars, elements, animals. He then immediately apologizes for anything that he says that might be going against the church. So here's where we get to the elephant in the room. This is a very, very Christian text. It is a hermetic Christian text, but it will be talking about the Most High God a lot. And it will be talking about the Most High God in various ways, and as such, I just needed to address that before anyone asks me why there are so many references to God, because the author was very Christian. This was a very pious Christian man, and he studied under an abbot for most of his occult training. So, what is magic? According to Agrippa, magic is the manipulation of virtue. We will learn what that is in section 4, and not a moment sooner. He then explains that natural science, aka modern science circa 1533, mathematics, and theology are the three philosophies referenced in the title, and magic is then hyped up as being the most valuable and sacred science, and the chapter is ended with, if you don't understand natural science, math, astrology, and theology, you cannot understand the rationale behind magic. All of these things are explained in the 3 books, to greater and lesser degrees. However, what he is effectively saying is that if you do not understand the 4 things he is talking about here, you will not understand this book. I am here to at least alleviate that a little bit. So, starting with the elements. There are 4 classical elements: fire, water, earth, and air. Everything is comprised of the 4 elements, and these are in a various state of transmutation and union, change and combining. When an inferior body is corrupted, they dissolve into elements. The best example of this is an animal, which has all 4 of the natural elements in it, turning from a living animal into being a skeleton. Because a skeleton is said to be only the element of earth, and the reason why it is that is because everything that is an inferior body means anything that isn't God. So God is the only thing that does not decay into elements. That being said, everything else will turn into elements when it either dies or some vague, nasty thing happens to it at the end of its lifespan, according to Agrippa. The elements will mix and mutate into each other. Water evaporates into air, but earth is special and split into changeable and, unchangeable and mixed. Mixed earth will always return to its earthly state after a while because it won't be fully dissolved into other elements. All earthly things must return to the earth. See previous comment about skeletons, because that's kind of where they got this from. There is also an explanation of the threefold separation of elements. bound, dissolved, and changed, which is important info for how to purify spirits and virtues, predict the future, and destruction of evil daemons, which is spirits. Now, this is claimed to be important, but it basically means you need to understand how the different elements are going to interact with each other. So the bound elements are going to be united with each other. They're going to, bond. The dissolved are going to be dissolved into each other, and changed is going to be something is temporarily changing into something else, right? So you're going to have water temporarily changes into earth, and then it changes back. That would be an example. And Agrippa gives a really bad explanation of what these elements are and what these states are. And I've read through book 1 multiple times, and I've read through book 2 a good number of times, as well as book 3. He never really brings this one up. He never really brings this up, except for the fact that if you understand how the separation of elements works, you can purify spirits, virtues, and allegedly predict the future and destroy evil spirits. The reason for this is because evil spirits are said to be unpure. And now, the qualities assigned to these elements, there are 2 major ways of classifying the elements. There is hot versus cold, and moist versus dry. Opposites in the system are fire versus water, and air versus earth. However, Plato's, which Agrippa really likes Plato, he quotes Plato quite often. Plato attributes sharpness, thinness, and movement to fire, dullness, thickness, and resting to earth, dullness, thickness, and movement to water, and dullness, thinness, and movement to air. Now, as you can all probably tell, resting is only a property of earth, sharpness is only a property of fire, and air and water have some variation of these. The opposites in this system become fire versus earth and air versus water. Now, that might sound a little bit similar because on the right, these are the style of elements we have in the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram of the Golden Dawn fame. So if you've ever been confused as to why the elements in the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram are air versus water and earth versus fire, this is the reason. It's a Platonic idea of the opposition of the elements. Elements are broken down individually, 2 per chapter. Fire is said to be the closest element to the divine. It can banish demons. All rituals should be done around a fire. Jesus was fire correspondent, and Agrippa mentions that you need fire safety. He actually does take a moment, and at the very end of the section on fire, he goes into fire safety. He also mentions that there are 2 types of fire. There is the celestial fire, the creative fire of the divine, as well as the destructive fire, which destroys everything. This is the fire that causes deserts, is an infernal fire. And Agrippa spends about half of the section on fire talking about Jesus. I mentioned he was a Christian. He does spend half of it talking about how Jesus was the fire that lit up the world, and the reason why you should be using fire is because it is symbolic of Jesus Christ in all things. That being said, when he quoted the person who was saying that you should always have a fire, he was quoting, I believe, either Plato or Plato quoting Socrates. So, yeah, this goes back beyond Jesus. That being said, the element of earth is given 2 whole paragraphs about how, while it's important, it's really just reacting to the other elements. Rain needs, earth needs crops. Rain for crops, fire burns earth, air to breathe life, and it allows it to move around. So air will be pushing dirt around and all that kind of thing. Now, the reason why he mentions that earth really is reacting is because, according to all medieval science, they believed that the earth only did things because of the other elements. Other elements include, air, fire, and water, obviously. And so they believe that when rain would fall onto the earth, it would just naturally cause plants to grow at the time. When air would go and move over earth, it would naturally cause like bugs and things to come out of it. This will be explained more later, but this is called, I believe, spontaneous genesis is the phrase. So they believe that life just came up out of nowhere. Water is said to be the oldest element. This is more related to the primordial waters of chaos. If you look back at the book of Genesis, actually, water is actually the first element mentioned. And if you look at the various books that explain the Bible a little bit deeper, they say that water is actually the first element that was created. Second is fire, through the divine words of God. Water is the one element of spiritual regeneration, one of the two elements required for the creation of the soul. Again, earth is the other one. And earth is required because water and earth unite and they create a soul. That is apparently how this works, according to Agrippa. And it is also said to be the most powerful because it can, quote, swallow the earth, quench fire, and climbs high and is held in the clouds, claiming the heavens as its own, in reference to rain. Agrippa really makes water sound like the most powerful element, purely because it is trying to really usurp and swallow up everything around it. It is trying to extinguish fire, which is said to be the most divine element. It is, the world is covered in like 75% water, which is what he means by swallow the earth. And rain will go over top of mountains, which is said to be the domain of air in most systems. So water is very much of importance. So of these, fire and water is going to be the most important elements, according to Agrippa. That being said, he then talks about air. Air is called the vital spirit. It is said to be a mirror into the divine and is the closest to the celestial realms, quite literally. He mentions how if there is death around, the reason why you can smell it is because the air around the murder has become so saturated with death that you can smell it, and you can smell the corruption in the air. So air is said to be carrying the energy. Reminder, this was medieval science. They didn't actually know about like how smell was transferred. They thought it was literally suffusing the air with the power of death, really. Which is quite a weird thing to think about, but, The element of air is also behind the powers of divination and dreams. Now, this is very bizarre, because what Agrippa is saying is that the element of air is actually the element that causes divination and dreams to function. Now, most people will attribute psychic abilities to water, but here Agrippa is actually making it clear to us as the reader that the element of air is the element that is going to cause divination to function. Which is very different, because I know that a lot of modern astrology and modern magic will be saying, oh, well, that's more of a water thing. Well, no, that's, according to Agrippa, an air thing, and there's various reasons for that. Agrippa is looking at this from a element perspective first. Most modern magic will look at things from a astrology perspective first. So we'll be looking at the planetary powers and the zodiacal powers instead of the elements first. Will actually be one of the interesting things between Agrippa and modern occultists is actually that Agrippa looks at the elements first and attributes everything else based on what attributes the elements give them. But modern astrology and modern occultism will be doing the opposite approach. So modern occultism will look at the planetary powers and the zodiacal powers, and they will apply those elements and those attributes to the actual elements themselves, because funny enough, none of the powers of the divination and dreams are attributed to any of the air signs. However, because Agrippa was looking at the elements as the building blocks, that's why he attributes that here. And that's why he says that water is the most powerful instead of the most mysterious. Agrippa then talks about the winds. Please reference chapter 6 of Agrippa's first book if you are looking for wind magic and the correspondence list. Reference chapter 7 for the correspondence list. Then list the zodiacal triplicities in order. These are going to be the fire signs of Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius, the water signs of Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces, the air signs of Libra, Aquarius, and Gemini, and the earth signs of Capricorn, Taurus, and Virgo. I believe Agrippa lists them in the order that they appear around the zodiac, and they appear in the zodiac in the Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces order. That's going to be the entire order that they appear around the zodiac, and they go in the reason why they are a triplicity is because they have different modes, and the different modes are going to be the cardinal sign, the fixed sign, and the mutable sign, which is how I listed them, because Taurus is actually a fixed earth. And there's various other ways that they go around the chart, but those are the important ways that they go around the chart, is that they're going to be cardinal, fixed, mutable, and then that will repeat. And elementally speaking, it starts with fire, then goes to earth, then goes to air, then water. So if you're ever wondering why the zodiac signs are 12 and why they always seem to go in those orders, that's why. Because we start with Aries and then we continue repeating the cycle, and it's just a really nice system. It then gives the elemental correspondences of the planet powers. The element of fire is said to be the Sun and Mars. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Sun is the gigantic ball of nuclear fusion that is up in the sky, and if it is currently daytime, you can look out your window and see it. The planet Mars is said to be the planetary power of war, and we will get into the heavy metal cover that is all of the Martial correspondences later on. Air is going to be Jupiter and Venus. I'm really not sure why he attributes air to Venus, because he will later attribute water to Venus, but it most likely has to do with the way that they subfuse the environments. Water is going to be Saturn and Mercury. Mercury is the most obvious one here. Mercury is going to be the liquid intelligence, so to speak, and if you look at the historical metal of Mercury, it is mercury, which is also known as quicksilver, which is liquid at room temperature. So Mercury is obviously going to be water. And Saturn is going to be water because of the primordial waters of chaos, and Saturn is said to be Saturn is the rules maker of the entire planetary lineup, so that's why we have Saturn as water. The eighth sphere and the moon are attributed to Earth. For those wondering what is the eighth sphere, you're standing on it, or if you're in a cloud city, it's below you significantly. The moon is kind of interesting. The moon being Earth is actually kind of weird, because when we think of the moon, we think of, oh, the moon is full. Like, modern occultists will look at the moon and say, like, oh, the moon is waxing. Now it's a time for manifestation. Oh, the moon is waning. Now is the time for banishing. Well, according to Agrippa, the reason why the moon is able to give us that information is not because of the moon. It is because the moon is being acted upon by effectively the celestial currents, and it is showing us what these celestial currents are most receptive to at that current time. For those of you wondering, the first Q&A break is after we're done talking about the elements, which is right now. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, feel free to come over here, stand at the microphone. I do have a couple questions that came up. Right. Some of these I guess I can save for the end, but I guess a relevant one is, you know, virtue is such a big deal in Agrippa's system or in his thinking. What's Agrippa's take on bring virtue into the world or into oneself, or however he would like to call that?
Yes. So the problem is when Agrippa says the word virtue, he does not mean what we think of virtues. He doesn't mean like, oh, charity. Don't be like, he's not thinking in terms of like the 7 virtues of like charity, kindness, humility. He's not thinking of those terms. Agrippa is thinking in terms of these are objective qualities that things have. And Agrippa says that the divine is what causes all of these virtues to be suffused into humanity. That being said, magic is supposed to be the art of giving yourself these virtues as well. So, and I believe he talks more in depth about this much later, towards the end, I think. It's after the occult virtue section.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Let's see, has anybody else thought of any questions yet? No?
If we could come back to that question after we get to that section, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, for sure. I'll leave it on the notepad. And I guess this is also one for maybe the end. Agrippa's books of philosophy are our greatest hits album, like you said. And those hits come from somewhere. So I'm curious how much of the stuff in there has been like traced back to its most ancient known roots. It's kind of a general question, so we can save it for the end.
That is actually a very good question, and if you had asked me before the Eric Purdue translation, I would say I have no idea. That being said, Eric Purdue did the wonderful work of backtracing every single thing that Agrippa wrote, and he cited every single source that Agrippa used. It is majority Pliny the Elder, Socrates, and Plato, with a lot of Iamblichus, and I believe he quotes Ficino like all the time, to the point where there is actually entire chapters that are just, here is a quote from a person, connecting line from Agrippa, here is another quote from a person. A majority of the book, at least in chapter 1, or at least in book 1, is not written directly by Agrippa. It is a majority written by other people that Agrippa is quoting and citing, without actually quoting and citing them, because this was the 1500s where you could get away with that. Can't get away with that anymore.
Gansu has done a long series of presentations on ceremonial magic in general, and he also traced a whole bunch of things back, just bringing up scholarship. Things like using candles goes way back to the earliest known civilizations, and it's very interesting that there's this lineage, either knowingly or not, people just passing on these things, and the ideas being collected and emerging together here and there. Super interesting.
Yep, let's take a quick break because I need to get some water, and my I don't know why, but the elements section always rips my voice apart a little bit, so.
Yeah, I think we're good to continue if you are, Dave.
All right, so, like Frog mentioned in the questions before we went on break, so what does Agrippa mean by virtues? Now, virtues has come up as a concept at least 6 or 7 times so far. It was mentioned in the intro. It's mentioned that different elements have their own unique virtues. And what Agrippa means by this is qualities and correspondences. These can be manipulated to create, quote, wonderful artificial things, such as fire that floats on water, fire that isn't put out by wind, and fireproof wood. A lot of things to do with fire, but you will notice that these actually these would have existed in the ancient world. So this would be in reference to alchemical fire, or Greek fire as it's known, which, if you are not familiar with that, it was basically fire that you could put into a pot, and then you would throw the pot at like a boat, and it would catch fire, and the water itself would catch fire, because it was actually burning like the oil and the various things like that. Fire that isn't put out by wind, this is just wind-proof furnaces, basically. And fireproof wood, we actually have this. Like, we have fireproof wood. This is like treated wood. So different virtues are attributed to the elements. the planets, the fixed stars, plants, and various animals. And this is going to be expounded upon. But for the most part, this is going to be different elements have different qualities to them. The different planetary powers have different qualities to them. The fixed stars have different qualities to them. Plants and animals both have different qualities, even in their own families. So, if we understand these virtues, we can use them for various magical operations. He gives an explanation of if you blind a lizard and put it into a bottle with a bunch of rings, you can take out the rings because the qualities associated with both the bottle and the lizard and the rings will help with eyesight. I have personally not tested this. I don't recommend other people test this, but this is what Agrippa says. Some virtues are attributed / caused by the elements. Some are specific to a particular species. And some are given by astrological powers. So, Agrippa makes a distinction here between virtues that are attributed to elements and that are caused by the elements. Now, when he says this, he means like some things are going to be inherent to the element of fire because it's the element of fire, but some things are going to be caused by the element of fire, like energy and spontaneous action. Some are going to be unique to a particular species or plant. For example, one of the, I believe he gives an example of like aloe vera is known for its healing properties. That is specific to aloe, and courage is specific to lions. Some are given by particular astrological powers, and these are manifested through a kind of a boiling down of the different powers and the different virtues into an individual, which Agrippa does explain. By manipulating the spirit and virtue of things, we can work magic, but we need to know what virtues are attributed to what and figure out how those different virtues. He gives a very technical explanation of how to figure out what virtues are attributed to what. It is extremely technical, and for the most part, it is through comparing what does and doesn't like the subject in question. So for the most part, it's going to be sheep and wolves. Wolves eat sheep. Sheep do not like wolves. Therefore, there are cowardly aspects to sheep, and there are predatory aspects to wolves. That's something that Agrippa mentions. More back on the cult virtues for a second. He goes through and he lists a bunch of very bizarre things. Like, he mentions a lot about the animosity between different things at one point. And I'm just going to say it. When Agrippa talks about occult virtues, it really does seem like he's just listing qualities that people would look at it and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like, he mentions that gems shine. Like, so there is a fiery aspect to gems. He mentions that certain types of stone don't burn, like asbestos doesn't burn, so it has a fiery quality to it. This continues for like an entire chapter when he's explaining like the various virtues, and this is also where, when he's talking about the different animosities between things, he will go through and he mentions how lodestones are disrupted by diamonds, which is not a thing, but the reason he got this was from Pliny the Elder, who seemed to have had contaminated diamonds, which is why I'm bringing that up, because if you read Agrippa straight, and you just read Agrippa, you think, diamonds affect magnets at all? And the answer to that question is no, they really don't, unless they are contaminated, which is what was going on there. Okay, this is where we get to the planetary attributions. Does anyone have any quick questions about occult virtues? We will be talking about virtues a lot, but just as the overview.
Just really quickly to get back to my question from earlier, I guess I better understand it now. It's like magic can be concerned with giving yourself, certain abilities, that are not natural to human. So he might be thinking about this in a way where it's like, well, this animal does this thing, this phenomenon does that thing. So if you want to make those your own or affect reality in some way, you're going to have to work with those correspondences. Is that correct?
That really is what's going on. But also, there's a section where Agrippa talks about animosities. And in the section, he's talking about how if you skin a sheep and you skin a lion, and you put the lion's skin over the sheepskin, it will dissolve the sheepskin.
Right.
Which Agrippa gives a lot of really good, understandable explanations of how virtues work. Like, there's occult sympathy between things, like some things actually have a friendship with other beings. And then for every good example he gives, he will give bad science because it was the best science that they had at the time. So that's partially why we're talking about this here.
Yeah, that's interesting, though. It's not so unfamiliar at all. You see this in so many different ways, like from folk stuff to ceremonial stuff. It's like, this thing embodies this quality that I want to embody, so now I'm going to do something with it. Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, so now we get to talk about the planets. Now, for those of you familiar with modern-day astrology, Agrippa's attributions are going to be very weird, but these are older than what most modern astrology is using, so take of that what you will. That being said, these are all more or less accurate, with some very rare exceptions. If it is a solar thing, which is attributed to the sun, it is yellow, bright, fiery, gold, or produces its own bright yellow light, or is something that generally causes happiness. Think sunflowers, lemonade. The concept of childhood innocence is solar correspondent. All of these things. If it's lunar, it's going to be white and silver crystals and stones. There is actually a stone called moonstone that kind of looks very lunar. Domesticated animals. And if it changes over time, its qualities are most likely lunar. Chameleons, hyenas, and amphibians are mentioned explicitly. For those of you wondering why hyenas are mentioned, chameleons and amphibians kind of make sense. A frog goes from a tadpole to a frog. Hyenas, they thought, literally changed from being male to female and female to male. They literally thought that about hyenas at the time. Saturn, if it's black, toxic, associated with death, or used in funerary rites and nothing else, it is ruled by Saturn. It is important to note that Agrippa will mention that certain virtues are inherited due to the use of certain things. A good example of this is, I believe, cypress wood is mentioned later on. I think it's cypress wood, where cypress wood is correspondent to Saturn because of its use in funerary rites at the time. This also actually, funny enough, that actually has a correlation with something that happened in Eastern practices, where they thought that incense, because they were burning incense during primarily funerary rites, incense became associated with death in the Far East. Which is an interesting cultural overlap there. For Jupiterian things, it's going to be all sweet and agreeable foods, which, if you know that Jupiter is about expansion, yep, that checks out. Easy to work with things. The metal of Jupiter is actually the easiest to work with out of all of these 7 classical metals. If it is dignified and proud animals, so this is going to be your bulls, your elephants, and your stags, which is going to be the male deer. If you look at the animal and it's like, that is a very proud animal. That animal, it has a certain amount of dignity to it. That kind of feeling, that's going to be Jupiterian. As well as tame animals such as sheep and lambs. Now, this is going to be weird, but trust me, Jupiter is going to get some far weirder attributions later on. Jupiter is basically going to be the easygoing but proud planetary power. It's going to be the king, but it's also going to be the benevolent king. Mars is anything sharp, angry, wants to stab you, and also anything that is warlike. Dragons and irritating. Fleas are explicitly mentioned. Dragons are also explicitly mentioned. I apologize for that notification on my phone. Dragons are explicitly mentioned here as being like a thing that is particularly martial, as well as like baboons and really anything that is like angry stabbing needles, right? Agrippa paints a really good picture of, if you've ever seen those 80s heavy album covers like Meatloaf's Bad Out of Hell, that's really going to be a martial correspondent thing. Venus is anything sweet, lustful, and luxurious. Goats are explicitly mentioned as being Venerean. Honey, I believe, is explicitly mentioned. And luxurious, I think we all know what luxury is. Basically, most of the modern world is going to be Venerean, funny enough. Mercury is going to be anything that is clever, active, and fast, as well as things that are, quote, various, exotic, and mixed. This is going to be all of your things that are out of the ordinary. If it's a very bizarre, like, edge case, for the most part, this is where the mercurial things will be, as well as the things that are going to be quick, clever, like crows, and anything that is, like, actively, active. So this is going to be the high energy, very fast, mobile things. He then does more correspondence tables, which I'm now going to summarize instead of going into detail. Chapter 30, he goes into detail on how the planetary aspects are distributed into natural processes. Chapter 32, he explains what belongs to each of the fixed stars and the major and minor constellations. These are going to be the Zodiac and the Decans, respectively, in modern day. Chapter 33, he's going to explain all things have their own seals and characters to them, as well as giving the characters of the planetary ones. What he means by this is literally, there is a secret language system that is within all things, and one of the methods is he puts a bone into a fire at some point, I believe, and he says that all fires will reveal these specific characters for the particular animals. Like, if you look at the individual subjects for long enough, you will find all of these particular characters. I haven't exactly tried this because it seems insane to me, but according to Agrippa, this is how it is. And for those of you wondering, how does Agrippa know all this? Don't worry, we will get there. We will get there. So, Chapter 34 is explaining how we can use natural things to attract the influence of the celestial realms. This one is actually useful. So what Agrippa mentions here is that there are different virtues that are inherent to different things, but in different amounts. What he means by this is, if you're going to make a talisman, let's say you want a talisman to be more charismatic, you would take on and find the various different things that correspond to charisma, you would make them into a talisman and you would use those, right? So you would take, if you wanted a more solar talisman, you would take a bunch of things that correspond to the sun, you would put them in a little baggie, and you can carry that around after charging it in the celestial rays, or however you would charge it. That is what Agrippa means by how to attract the influence of the celestial realms, because according to occult virtue theory, that talisman, if you have a critical mass of that specific quality, should impart it onto whoever has it. Which is very useful, and this is like kind of the principle behind how talismans work. Moving on. So, Agrippa then mentions how to mix elements to create certain effects. There are two types of mixing for celestial powers, general and specific. So this is going to be what I just mentioned, solar or just healing. Now, Agrippa mentions that not everything is going to have the same amount of virtue. Not everything is going to have the same amount of solar properties. Sometimes all the properties are going to be mixed, and sometimes the various properties, even within the same family of different things, are going to be different. The more noble something is, the more powerful the influence is it receives, and from the nobler forms, lesser forms are, quote, generated. Wasps are generated from horses. Both apparently are martial, according to Agrippa, because horses are warlike, and remember, this is back in the time when we had cavalry. Now, for those of you wondering what he means by generated, this is where I have to come up and explain the spontaneous generation theory. What he means by this is that in medieval science, there was a theory called spontaneous generation, where various things would literally cause lesser beings to be quite literally generated. So if you ever go to a horse stable and you see that there are a bunch of flies that are surrounding the horses, modern science would say that the horses are attracted to the, modern science would say that the flies, are attracted to the horses because of, what goes on in a horse stable. That's not what the ancients thought. The ancients didn't see the flies coming in. They thought that they were literally being generated as a byproduct of the horses being around. Which, if that sounds a little bit crazy, it is. But, context, we have hindsight. This was back in the time where they just took everything as gospel. Like, if it was written in an old book, they took it as gospel, which definitely doesn't happen nowadays. I know. So they had a book that was written by Pliny the Elder in circa 600 BC, and that was the Pliny the Elder science, quote, quote, was held up as being empirically true for literally centuries. So they just went through this science and they didn't question it. They just agreed because that's what the ancients thought, so that must be true. Because the ancients were always right. That is not how that worked. So, magicians can attract the celestial influences through sound, incense, light, and other natural things that agree with the celestial forces. For those of you who know how occult rituals work, that should sound very familiar to people, because to rephrase this, magicians attract these celestial influences through prayers and god names, incenses of the particular forces we want to work with, and changing various colors of lights, and other natural things like talismans that agree with the celestial forces. So right here, Agrippa just spells out for us how magic works. We are pulling celestial forces through the various virtues by doing the various movements, saying the correct god names if you are of the ceremonial bent, saying the correct prayers that agree with the celestial forces that we are trying to call up, burning the correct incenses, lighting the correct candles, and various other natural things that agree with the celestial forces. So right here, we have just explained how magic works. We have 9 slides left to go. So, Here is how Agrippa breaks down fundamental magical techniques. And for those of you wondering, this is where we finally got to the practical magic. We have finally gotten to the practical magic. And before this, I just want to mention, because I don't know if it's in these slides, you might be wondering how Agrippa knows all of these things. Agrippa knows these things because other people have written them down. Agrippa knows that dragons exist because somebody wrote down that dragons exist. Agrippa knows about that one curing blindness spell because somebody wrote down an occult experiment where they did that. Agrippa knows all these virtues because it was written down in a book. To quote Agrippa, it was so miraculous that it had to have been true. Putting it another way, trust me, bro, we know that it happened, it's in a book. Which again, we definitely just don't blindly trust books nowadays. I know that no one I know personally just says, oh, it's in a book, it must be true. Especially not myself, who did that literally this morning. So, for now, we get into the various different methods by which Agrippa lists as being actual magical techniques. And this is where we get into the fun stuff. So, Agrippa lists out, and I have given an arbitrary rating system for each of the different methods that Agrippa lists as being magical techniques. Okay? So, to begin, we have bindings. This is magic to either prevent something from happening or to bind something to happening. So this is going to be binding stuff from harm. Agrippa mentions binding storms so that they cannot occur, so that the sailing ships can actually get where they need to go safely, as well as love bindings and bindings into getting people sick. This is a 9 out of 10. Binding spells are amazing. If you bind, you can bind money to go into your wallet. It's really helpful. 9 out of 10. This is fantastic. Everyone should at least consider this at some point. Sorcery. I've written fantasy sounding magic here because this is where Agrippa just basically says, yeah, this is like throwing fireballs. Sorcery is throwing fireballs, according to Agrippa. He then lists necromancy and shapeshifting, which is also incredibly weird because Agrippa does go into necromancy, and there is actually a contemporary necromantic tradition that existed around the time when Agrippa was writing. But then he mentioned shape-shifting like into wolves and gives a story about how people would... So Agrippa gives a couple stories about this. And I have no idea how much of this is the trust me, it was written in a book category, or if it's some vague magic worked differently back then and he's being metaphorical. But he mentions a story about how witches would have their husbands transform into donkeys so that they could more easily pull carts, and then they would change them back when they got to their destination. So in case you were wondering what Agrippa means by shape-shifting, he literally means turning into animals, and I believe he mentions werewolves at one point. This gets question marks out of 10. This is literally unrateable because I have yet to figure out any spell that will allow me to actually turn into an animal or a dragon. So until I've done that, this is an unrateable category, because everyone aspires to become a dragon. So, oh, here's a quick note. Sorcery actually gets 2 chapters. The first one explaining all of the various different things, such as, oh, this is going to be, this is going to be how, like, shapeshifting and necromancy and all this stuff. And then he describes women as effectively eldritch monsters. And, for a good chunk of this, you could replace the phrase menstrual blood with xenomorph blood, and it would do exactly what he is describing. Like, if you've ever seen the movie Alien, he describes them as basically that. He also says that the people who were doing this are actually the reason why there were laws against magic in Rome. I don't really have anything practical to mention here, but I just thought it was really funny that he just decided to go full into the Trithemius boat of, yeah, women are eldritch monsters and we should fear them. And this is why we have laws against magic. Thanks, Agrippa. He then talks about fulmigations. This is more commonly known as incenses. This is going to be to infuse the air with particular powers, and specialty blends create specialized effects. 5 out of 10, everyone does this. Now, here's the interesting thing. If we go back to that section where I mentioned about how the elements are suffused with celestial power, specifically air, what Agrippa is saying is that when you are burning incense, you are literally filling the air with the powers of that particular incense. So when you create a blend for healing, you are quite literally going through and suffusing the air with the powers of healing. Which is really cool, but also, I wish it worked that way, and I wish we didn't know how smells actually propagate, because that would be really cool, but unfortunately we do, and this is not exactly how this works, but people still burn incense. This is going to be colories, ointments, and love potions. Okay, this is going to be magical cosmetics that make people fall in love with you, and various other effects. Agrippa says various other effects, but he then proceeds to... He really just... The only thing is he mentions the cheese that turns people into mules so they can carry loads. Like, they can carry heavy loads, which I mentioned in the sorcery section. For the most part, this is just going to be love spell makeup. And they believe that the way that colories worked is that, for those of you who don't know, colories are actually like effectively magical eyeliner. And what they do is, according to the magic of ye olden days, they believed that colories worked because you would place them under your eyes, and your eyes would project the light onto the object. So effectively, you were beaming the desire for people to love you into their eyes by looking into them with this magical makeup on. Magical ointments are going to be similar, but they're going to be applied to different places, and love potions, you could effectively put this as all kind of like magical tinctures. Yeah, I think I'm saying that right. This is going to be 4 out of 10 because in modern day this is a massive pain to make, because it's going to cause you to have to distill a bunch of different things, and yeah, it's just not practical in modern day. He then goes into allegations and suspensions. These are going to be talismans made to hang. These are going to be either hung around your neck like an amulet, or they're going to be hung in a space. Think of like those, if you've ever seen those like wards that are hung in a space, that's what these are. So they're going to be hung in a space or in a room, and they're going to allow their magical virtue to suffuse into the room, and that's how they're going to work. These are going to be a 6 out of 10. They can be a little bit of a pain to construct because, again, construction is going to be the biggest problem with these. So, he then mentions rings. What Agrippa mentions with this is that enchanted rings can be used to manipulate emotions, like, he mentions a example of giving somebody a ring to make them more courageous or more of a more effective general and protection. He mentions that you don't actually need to make the ring, you just need to give it the virtue. So this is an 8 out of 10 if you were somebody who likes to make rings, or make or wear rings, because what you can do, take a ring, enchant it, and then you can just give it the powers that you were desiring, as long as the natural materials have the various different things in them. And I apologize if you hear my dogs. So, he then mentions the different virtues of places. Different places have different energies to them. So he mentions that if you're going to do a martial ritual, you might want to do it in a bakery. I don't know about you, but I don't have access to an easy bakery that I can just go into, do a magical ritual, and not have owners care. So this is going to be a 5 out of 10. Can't control it that well. However, I want to mention this because this actually does apply. If you have a dedicated room where you are doing your magical practice, this does apply, and it makes it so that you have the ability to do more effective magic in the room that you have attributed to being the magic performing room. So if you have like a magical space, you can do it there, and that would apply there. So make of that what you will. Lights, colors, and lamps. Color correspondences are... color correspondences and how to cause visions. So this gets a 9 out of 10 for the colors, because I think everyone knows about, like, if you want to do candle magic, you can just use different colors of candles, and that's pretty common. If you have color-changing lights, like if you have LED lights that change colors, you can use those mid-ritual. That's pretty 9 out of 10. 0 out of 10 for causing the visions, though, because Agrippa literally mentions putting things in your eyes like eye drops to cause you to hallucinate and have visual hallucinations. I don't recommend. Don't do that. I shouldn't need to tell you that, but don't. Then we have bewitchings. Bewitchings are where the chanter... This is where the enchanter enters the eye of the bewitched until it reaches their heart. So, this is where you look into the eyes of a person, you look into the eyes of your target, and you magically affect their heart and cause them to feel various effects. This is effectively going to be like a curse, where they can either look at something or you look into their eyes, and they're going to feel particular things and cause various other effects, notably pain or disaster. This is going to be... You are bewitching them. So, bewitching, I have no idea what he's talking about here, because this seems to be a thing that he has not done, but he is referencing other people doing. And effectively, it is by looking through somebody's eyes, you are putting a spell on them. Which is, again, very weird, and it follows the Agrippa, trust me, I read it in a book, so it must be true, line of reasoning. Does anyone have any questions about anything we've talked about so far?
I personally don't. Any questions, folks? Feel free to come up here to ask them.
Yep, we're good.
All right.
We can hear you perfectly.
I was thinking in the bewitching part that is like a subcategory of binding. They call it hypnosis, no? Or um, um, when you try to change how people perceive an event, like a disassociation. It has some basis on that, but I was thinking that that's basically a medieval description in psychology for that. Just out of curiosity, that it made some sense later on.
So, you're right in that it sounds very similar to hypnosis, but due to the weird gap in our knowledge, it is not hypnosis in the slightest. What he is saying is that you look into the eyes of somebody, and by looking into the eyes of somebody, you put a spell on them. That is quite literally what he's saying. Like, you look into the eyes of a witch, and the witch puts a spell on you to where you will just suffer disaster for no reason, because she just put a spell on you. Keep in mind, this also goes along with the magical makeup. So, what they effectively. So, the reason why Bewitching and the magical eyeliner, as I'm going to call it, because the word is weird and it's not modern, the reason why those are the way that they are and they look similar to other things is because you need to understand that in the past, they quite literally thought that you projected light out of your eyes. Like, they thought that you projected light out of your eyes, and that the thing that fire and the sun was allowing you to do was propagate that light into the darkness. It was not a hypnosis at all. I kind of wish it was, because it would make more sense. But no, this is where you're like mentally entering into their mind, more specifically, but just by looking at them, not giving them hypnotic triggers or anything.
So it's like I don't know if it was Plato. I think it was Plato that associated the eyes as the door of the element of fire. Like the eyes are the window to the soul, and the soul is divine fire, or the fire of life. So they went with the idea that your soul can have an effect on somebody else's soul by connecting or having the eyes as the medium. But well, it's like a stretch of that concept, but I guess that was the idea.
No, that you hit the nail on the head. What they're doing is they're taking the eyes or the window into the soul's concept, and they are saying bewitching is going through your eyes into your heart and then putting a spell on your heart. That is what they are saying bewitching is.
Yeah, and I think the nuance is also, right, you're not gaining control of the other person. Like, some metaphysical disaster will befall them, you know, like that's right. The thing, right? So like trees will start falling on their heads, or maybe a dragon will appear to eat them, or some other disaster like that. Which, yeah,
right, because according to Agrippa, dragons are real, 100%.
Can understand why somebody would see a nuance between that and, you know, taking control of a person's actions or perception. Yeah, it's interesting though. Yeah.
That was my comment. Thank you very much.
Awesome. So my question is, if they enter your eyes to place this magic on your heart to bind you to something, would this also be used to bind someone to a curse said, let's put like immortality? Could somebody be binded to life, binded to not dying?
So, theoretically, yes. Theoretically, yes. That is what, according to Agrippa, that you might be able to even say that corresponds to like disaster or pain, because if you are immortal. But functionally, no. And Agrippa would say functionally no as well, due to the fact that that goes against God, and it goes against the natural order of things. Like, everything is said to have a shelf life. Everything ends, right? But theoretically, you could just make that ending last a long time.
Okay, now
So you
if
could,
that's...
you could, go ahead.
So now, if that goes against the order of things, where do you draw the line from this is too much to I can achieve this? Where do you draw the line?
Nothing exists that has the qualities of immortality.
Okay.
So basically, if it is a quality that exists in other things, it can be attributed to other things, right? So I'll give you an example. Love spells are mentioned a lot. Things fall in love all the time. According to Agrippa, you can use those to bind somebody into falling in love. You can't bind somebody into being immortal because nothing is immortal except for God. Does that make sense?
Got it. So something that would happen within the normal ratio of things in life.
It needs to be in the... It doesn't need to be in the normal set of experiences, but it does need to be a thing that exists, right? So you can't just be like, oh, I'm going to become strong, right? If nothing was strong, you couldn't do that. But because things are strong, like, you know, people who go to the gym, those people are strong, you can become one of those people. According to Agrippa, that is getting the virtue of strength.
So through binding itself, you couldn't kind of pull a Cardophilius moves, for example. When are you aware of Cardophilius, the story of Cardophilius?
I am not.
So in the Bible, Cardophilius was a Roman soldier who threw rocks at Jesus, and Jesus cursed them to live forever. So through binding, since that's something of a godlike power that goes against the order of things, it wouldn't be possible, technically, it wouldn't be possible because it goes against the order of things, the order of God.
Right. So the explanation there is that Jesus was special. Like that really is the Agrippa style explanation for yeah, Jesus could do that because Jesus was the Son of God. We're not allowed to do that because Jesus being the Son of God means that he can give people various things like immortality. That being said, we are not Jesus, and I've never met anyone who's immortal. Have you?
No.
Well, maybe I can add my 2 cents. The kind of magic we're talking about here, even though dealing with lesser seen forces and all that, it's still subject to the laws of nature and all that. So definitely, like you said, something that you can expect to work, and things that are like outside of the realm of what can reasonably expect it to work. And in that sense, you know, it's kind of like technology, like figuring out, okay, which things are we dealing with and what are effective methods to interact with them, you know, and what are the results that we, you know, can expect, how are they brought about and all that stuff.
Also, I know that the next section is divination, but I want to just go back a little bit to the virtue section and cover something I missed. So, because I forgot that I have an entire section of notes here. So, to really give you all an explanation of what virtues kind of do, virtues are going to be the qualities, but they're going to interact very differently. So Agrippa mentions that, like, the planetaries, now that we've gone over the planetaries and we've gone over a bunch of other stuff, have different relations. Are we... Okay. Cool. All right, so different virtues are going to be friendly and animosity, and have animosity towards each other. So certain virtues are going to like each other, and certain virtues are going to hate each other. Think oil and water. oil and water, according to Agrippa, would have an animosity towards each other because oil does not mix with water. That's pretty simple. I think we can agree. Where this gets into a little bit of a weird part is that Agrippa goes through, and Agrippa will say such wonderful things as, there is a section where he talks about occult animosities, and he mentions how if an olive tree is planted by a prostitute, the olive tree will refuse to grow fruit because it is so aghast. It is disgusted by by the fact that the prostitute has grown the olive tree, that it will just not grow olives. It will just... And I believe Agrippa mentions that the reason this happens is because, quote, they are so disgusted by the audacity of them and the lack of prudishness that this is the reason, right? Agrippa also mentions that there are different attributes, like different particular animals will have different qualities to them. They will have different virtues. Some will be more cowardly, some will be more dynamic, some will be more courageous, and these are given by astrological natal charts. He basically says they're given by astrology. They're given by astrological natal charts. This is why different people are different. This is why different animals are different. Everything of that nature, Agrippa attributes to astrology. Every single thing, right? This also causes Agrippa to attribute things like divination to birds. And this is the entire reason why I wanted to go back here to explain that a little bit, because I realized I didn't really explain occult virtues as much as I needed to in order for this to actually make sense, because we're about to get into the weirdest section of the book, which is all about bird divination. And in case you're wondering, dogs have a occult virtue of being loud and being alert, which is why you might be hearing them now. So, I'm going to skip over chapter 52, which is weird face divination stuff. Agrippa then proceeds to talk about auspices and auguries, which are going to be omens. Natural omens, and he lists a chart for the 12 types, then explains the various different animals and their types in giving different auguries, and then finally gives rules for proving and disproving them. Now, I'm not going to read all of these different types, but I do want to read the general structure by which they function. Because when I was going back through my notes, I read that it was based on if you see a person walking and if you also see a bird, which side of the person the bird is on is the important section. So the reason why I say this is because one of these types of auguries that I'm not even going to try to pronounce is an augury when you leave your house for some reason and you see a man or a bird passing or flying, and they are placed in front of you on the left. This is a good sign. So, according to Agrippa, depending on if you see a bird or a person in front of you and what side of you they are on when you see them, determines whether or not you will have a good day. Agrippa then paraphrased says that, and if it doesn't happen, it was an invalid augury or you interpreted it wrong. I love Agrippa. But he basically just says, yeah, if it doesn't happen, it wasn't true. Yeah, no, that was a lie. Yeah, it wasn't really an omen, it was just bullshit. That's how Agrippa rolls sometimes. Agrippa then lists the various types of animals in auguries, and he gives different rules for if it's like a Jupiterian animal, it will mean this. If it's a lunar animal, it will mean this. If it's a Venerian animal, it means this. He lists all of these various things, and they're quite useful, but I really would have appreciated them if he had not just put, yeah, if this doesn't work, it was a lie, and you misinterpreted it, or you just didn't understand something. So that kind of upsets me a little bit. Portences. I'm going to paraphrase the entirety of that chapter. If it seems like a good omen, it is. Agrippa then mentions elemental divination, and he mentions hydromancy, aeromancy, and pyromancy here. He does not mention geomancy, because hydromancy, aeromancy, and pyromancy are all going to be effectively a form of scrying, where you're going to look into a bowl of water, the clouds, or a fire, in the case of hydromancy, aeromancy, and pyromancy respectively, and you're going to discern shapes, and you're going to interpret what those clouds mean for you. Geomancy is nothing like that, and it is discussed at length in Chapter 2, because geomancy is actually math divination, and Agrippa loves his math divination. So much so that he actually lists, like, there's multiple chapters on geomancy. It's a very good system, by the way. If you're not familiar with geomancy, I highly recommend you look it up, but we don't have time to cover it here, and it's not even in this book. Hydromancy and aeromancy are divination by interpreting the impressions in water and air respectively. Now, this is where it gets a little bit weird, because he breaks down a little bit some of the various different types of aeromancy and hydromancy. He mentions that if you're doing aeromancy, it's really helpful to do it near a natural body of water, if I remember right. And the reason is because you can discern the shapes in the water more easily. And they tell you about events that are either coming or, you know, they tell you about coming events because the current is flowing to where you are. The news is traveling to where you are. Aeromancy is going to be mostly clouds. He gives a listing of how to interpret clouds. Pyromancy, there's actually various different types, and so this is going to be divination by interpreting impressions in a fire. I mentioned scapulomancy here because this is a Far Eastern Chinese practice of you throw a bone into a fire and you read the symbols in the bone, and that's how you do the divination there. Kind of interesting how pyromancy is like a universal phenomenon. He also specifically mentions copinomancy, which is going to be smoke divination. There's also ceromancy, if I remember correctly, which is wax divination. I don't believe he mentions that, but that is how a candle burns down, actually can tell you about how the results of the candle will work. I'm going to skip over chapter 58, which is, I am not making this up, how to get a good night's sleep and how to revive the dead. I know all the aspiring necromancers are in shambles right now. I apologize. We will not be talking about how to raise the dead. I am just as heartbroken as you are, but it is not practical. Dream divination. He mentions how you can divine things through dreams, and it is best to do this when the moon is in the 9th house of your natal chart. Specifically when it is transiting your 9th in your natal chart, which is actually kind of actionable. Funny, this is like actually actionable advice from Agrippa here. Chapter C is a detailed analysis on how melancholic people are more prone to madness, possession, frenzy, and spontaneous divination. For those of you who don't know, he's literally saying people who are more prone to depression are more prone to madness, possession by spirits, spontaneous emotional frenzy, and occasional bouts of divination. I don't know why he puts this here, but like most things in the later section of Book 1 of Agrippa, it is here, and I wanted to mention it because it's just that weird. Okay, he then mentions, this is, okay, so I call this section the components of the mind. Agrippa starts by talking about how the soul is made, and how it's made and has various different parts, needs, and it has various different passions. It mentions how the soul and the mind are made up of different yet complementary virtues. So your soul is going to be the driving thing that is going to make it so that you are happy, but your mind is going to be the thing that is going to make it so you can exist, right? So if you're not happy, it's a soul problem, and if you're happy but you're not doing the things that are making you happy, that's a mind problem. So he mentions how these are going to be based on different things. He mentions the story about the worker, the virtues of the worker, and the physician explicitly in chapter 66. So he mentions how the virtues of the worker are going to be different from the virtues of the physician, and how the virtues of the physician are that they have an innate desire to heal, if I remember correctly. There is a large section on passions detailing inclinations of passions and the various types and how they form. They form based on the soul and different aspects of a person's soul. And once again, Agrippa blames astrology. And how these passions are both affected by the individual and the effects that they have on their body. Now, this is where Agrippa is saying that the various passions are going to affect you, and they're going to physically change how you look. Okay? So, for example, if you are somebody whose passions just determine that you are supposed to be strong, you will physically work out and you will physically look strong, and that will be an indicator of that passion. When it says passions, think driving desires. They're going to be like the driving, motivating factors of the person. Okay? He also mentions that the most important part is that you need to have full confidence in your magical operation, because if you do, it will dissipate and break the virtue of the mind that causes magic to function. If you don't believe in your magic, according to Agrippa, there is a part of your mind that is the reason why magic functions, and if you disbelieve your magic, your mind is fighting with itself, and that causes magic to fail. Which is very interesting because we have similar things in modern day. Make of that what you will. And this is where Agrippa talks about how the mind is connected to the divine. So, Agrippa says that the mind will attract what it is. If your mind has determined that you are to be vehemently loved, it will be loved. Like, you will be loved if your mind has dictated that you need to be vehemently loved, right? This is example by Agrippa. If it says that you are an evil monster, you will attract hatred and destruction in equal amounts. Your mind attracts what it is most desiring and most receptive to. As a general rule, the mind attracts what it is most suitable to. What he means by this is you will attract that which you are supposed to attract. According to Agrippa, the mind will attract that which you are supposed to attract. However, due to the way that the mind works, it can also attract, bind, and impede things due to large-scale manipulations of virtues. If you become more solar, it will also attract admiration and loyalty, so on for the other influences. Love for Venus and sadness for Saturn are explicitly notable examples. What he means by this is if you are manipulating virtues, aka if you are invoking planetary powers or using them, it will bring you those things. So if you're working with the sun, it will bring you admiration and loyalty. And it will also bring you love for Venus. It will bring you sadness and depression for Saturn, because that was the sad planet back in the day, and that one is still the sad planet in modern day. Saturn, never a happy guy, never a happy planet. On speech. So, you remember how Agrippa mentions that different sounds cause different celestial things to come, the different celestial influences? Well, Agrippa says that words and phrases have virtues in and of themselves, and prayers and songs are used to attract the desired virtues that one would aim for. If anyone is familiar with the Orphic hymns, this is what he is talking about. If anyone is familiar with any invocationary prayers, this is what he is talking about. When constructing prayers, go with things that are sympathetic to what you are trying to do, not what the energies you're calling are antagonistic to. For good examples, once again, go to the Orphic hymns. If you are trying to attract a Venus, you should be using lovely romantic language. You should not be calling Venus the goddess by which all wars are fought and whom the fires of destruction burn in order to conquer. Don't do that. That's a martial invocation. And also, I'm pretty sure that would invoke Mars, or like a very martial aspect of whatever Venerian powers you are trying to call up. Don't do that. Don't do that. Good things with, like, Venerian things with Venerian things. Martial things with martial things. Don't try to mix the streams here. Names. Certain names have power and individual virtues. This is a weird take where he just says that, like, if you're named John, there is a certain quality of the name John that you are imparted with because of your name. That is, roughly speaking, what he is explaining. This also corresponds to names of God, but it also corresponds to all names, like cats. The name cat has certain virtues that the animals get because they are attributed, like, animals receive names based on what we call them. Like, the name of the seas also has that effect. It's a very weird concept. Invocation is done purely with the spirit and is best when you are calling using the celestial qualities, and when enchanting objects, magicians will often blow and breathe onto them the words as to breathe virtue into the object. Allegedly, older enchantment methods would have you recite the prayer over top of the object like you are breathing the virtues into it. I have not seen modern enchantment methods do this. That being said, it is pretty interesting because in a lot of modern things, what you will do is you will write the actual names onto the object, depending on what method and what the tool you're using is and what you're trying to actually consecrate. Incantations. These are songs that are said to be filled with magical power, and these incantations can have miraculous effects, such as causing the moon to fall out of the sky. Quoting Agrippa, paraphrase, trust me, bro, I read it in a book somewhere. Trust me, he read this in a book somewhere. I believe he actually mentions that there was another incantation to put the moon back where it belonged. So I have no idea. Apparently, there are incantations. Apparently, if we sing the right songs, the moon will stop showing up. So make of that what you will. No, I don't know the song, and Agrippa doesn't give it to me, because he doesn't want the moon to disappear. Finally, we go on to the powers of writing and written language. Writing is the highest form of language, as it is the result of refining the words and thoughts. If you're if you're writing a book, you need to refine your thoughts more than if you just say them, which Agrippa was not around. You know, Agrippa wasn't really around before the advent of YouTube videos where you had to refine your thoughts, but he, you know, I think he would still agree that you need to refine your thoughts more if you're writing them down than in a YouTube video. So make of that what you will. Magicians also say that you write something down. Okay. Agrippa mentions here one of my biggest pet peeves about modern occult authorship, which is magicians also say that you write something is to be used in a ritual, right? There's a bit of a typo there, but when you write something, you write down why the thing is there in your notes. You don't leave that out. You don't assume anyone knows anything. Because if you want somebody to do a ritual, you write down why every single thing is where it is. You don't just go ahead and be like, oh, yeah, just use this specific color candle because reasons. You write down the reason why every single thing and every single piece is where it is. You write down why the incense is there. You write down why the candles are there. You write down why you're calling up the specific spirit. If you're doing invocations, you write down why you're doing those invocations. This whole reason, this right here, is the reason why the Goetia from the Lesser Key is popular, because it's the only book that actually writes down why every single thing is where it is, among other reasons. There is an explanation of Hebrew and Greek dividing down into correspondences for 7 planets, 12 signs, 3 or 5 elements, 3 for Hebrew and 5 for the Greek. Now, it's important to note that the difference here is that the Greek will have elements for the fire, water, and earth. No, my bad. Fire, water, earth, air, and spirit for Greek, and Hebrew will only have it will only have air, water, and fire for the Hebrew. It will not have spirit, and it will not have earth. But the Greek does, which is notable. This really is just an explanation for giving letter correspondences, though. Just as a heads up, this is to give an explanation of why Greek and Hebrew have letter correspondences of the various planets, signs, and elements. So make it that what you will. Now, keep in mind, this is where we have dedicated questions. If there is anything that you think I didn't cover enough, please feel free to ask questions. I skipped a lot. Most of this book is correspondence tables, and in this presentation, some of the important / well-known parts of Agrippa are actually in books 2 and 3. Notably, the spirit section where he talks about the Agrippa daemon and the intelligence of the planets are actually in book 2, if I remember correctly. They're in book 2 or book 3. And this book is 90% quotes by volume. I skipped a lot of stuff in this book. I skipped a lot of stuff in book 1. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask, and I will try to answer them as best I can.
Yeah, if there's anybody with any comments or questions about book 1, or perhaps Agrippa in general, or perhaps even related things, feel free to come up here, ask your questions. I guess I could start us off with a small comment or thought I had. You know, the whole thing of your things attracting more of what they are, right? That's also, in my mind, the basis for what I and another user here, Metro Saint, have recently talked about. I guess we call it do the thing magic, where, you know, just bring one of these elements into your life, and you know, the correspondences with those things should follow, especially if it's the intention, you know, and you're a magician and you're doing other things too. So I don't know, it might be something like you know, wear a suit, see what happens, and other things like that.
Yeah, it really is the concept of dress for the job you want, not the job you have. Like, dress for the job. If you want to be a rich banker, go wear a suit and tie. But if you want to, like, if you are not where you are, like, wear the suit for the job you want, not the job you have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
I think everyone's probably heard of that phrase before. That really is what Agrippa is saying. If you use that, and if you have manipulated the virtues enough, the virtues of the suit will cause you to get the higher paying job, if that is what your desire and your intention is.
This is interesting because, I mean, maybe the ethics of this and like the meta perspectives is a whole discussion for another time, but, you know, being sincerely generous and good to other people, you know, to the bone, I wonder what that will bring about, you know, if this rings true, at least. Things like that. So, yeah, I think in my life, this is a very important thing to go off of. Maybe more so even than all of the things that take place in the setting up like a magical ritual. You know, this is how you can turn every moment of your life, perhaps into an exercise of talismanic magic, and, you know, become a better person at the same time. Again, genuinely. So, yeah, some thoughts there.
Yeah, and I just wanted to mention the generosity thing, because according to Agrippa, that would actually bring, like, an increase in, like, wealth. So if you're being generous and you're being just generally more Jupiterian things will happen to you. If you're being more solar things will happen to you. You get what you put out, is basically what Agrippa is saying. Like, if you just put out negative, sad stuff all the time, you will get negative, sad stuff all the time, according to Agrippa, at the very least. Who would have thought that in the same book that we learned that olives can't grow if they've been planted by prostitutes, we would also learn that be the change you want to be in the world is in fact a magical practice? Who would have known?
Well, yeah, this is a question I ask to everybody. Regarding the thing that they're presenting. You know, and sometimes things are presented here that are definitely more on the side of this isn't going to be any use to you unless you do the work, you know, and you actually spend years making the system your own and so on. Is there a way to make use of Agrippa without becoming a full-fledged occultist? Is there stuff in there that is useful for anybody that's looking for spiritual wisdom of any kind?
Well, in addition to the various weird things about magical fish, dragons, and the like, Agrippa basically paints a picture that everyone is doing magic. Like, Agrippa was not writing a magical book, he was writing a physics textbook. He was basically saying that, like, this happens because of these things, and these things. And by doing so, Agrippa effectively went ahead and he really did go ahead and make a kind of sort of told everyone that they're doing magic regardless of whether or not they like it or not. And he basically said, you get what you put into the universe, in a much more medieval Christian sort of way. The biggest takeaways from Agrippa, if you don't want to become like a hardcore ceremonial magician, which Agrippa gets lumped into, but if anything, we've learned that Agrippa really wasn't going ahead, and Agrippa really wasn't going ahead to like, yes, we're going to make a bunch of ceremonial magic stuff. He was really just like, here is why things work. Here is magical practices. Here is why the things work in those magical practices. Such as going through, if you burn a candle, according to Agrippa, that is opening a door to the divine. If that is a possibility for you. If you read Agrippa, the biggest takeaways from Agrippa, and I think I'm like 90% sure my answer has changed. The biggest takeaways from Agrippa are that magic is actually really easy. It's just that you just need to know how. And the whole thing about Agrippa is that he is trying to teach how to do magic in a very efficient way, in like the most high concept way possible. So make of that what you will. That being said, I have yet to find any other records about the using cheese to turn people into mules, or the shape-shifting, or why you would want to raise the dead.
Yeah, I mean, it goes without saying, so much so that maybe it bears saying it again, but pretty much any esoteric or occult work you're going to read, it's going to be this mixed bag of great stuff and, pure absurdity.
And in case y'all are wondering some of the weirder things I left out, he talks about magical fish that stop storms. He talks about animal talismans can be made, but only if the animal is alive will they work. So if you have a tooth necklace, it will only work if that animal is alive. He goes into great detail about this, by the way. This isn't like a little bit. This is a full chapter I've skipped over. He goes off on the various different types of animosity, and the problem is Agrippa talks about this in book 1 and then never again. Agrippa really has a lot of stuff and a lot of concepts that he drops in the second book. He doesn't really talk about occult virtue at all in the second book. That being said, he does talk about math, so there will be a lot of math in the next talk, and I will be cutting down 99% of it if I can possibly get away with it.
Is there anything you can say about the things that Agrippa went on to influence? Because, I mean, it's kind of like a lot of stuff come together there, a lot of different influences from the past. But, from that specific point on, it also branches out again, goes on to influence all sorts of stuff. You have any thoughts to share about that at all?
Agrippa invents sigil magic in book 3. This is not a bit. He does. I will show y'all when we get to book 3, but you gotta wait until we get through book 2 first. That being said, things Agrippa has influenced. He influenced the construction of prayers. He influenced talismanic magic. He made hermetic Kabbalah effectively. He's the one who popularized hermetic Kabbalah due to a very bizarre mix-up that Agrippa thought that Kabbalah was actually older than it was, because one of his sources basically said it was older, so he just kind of took it at face value, and then he had a lot of really bad Hebrew. I'm not going to clear that up, but yeah. Basically, if you are familiar with any practices that use hermetic Kabbalah, Agrippa has influenced them in some way or another. Every single one of them. So yeah.
Theosophy too?
Theosophy as well, I would say.
Yeah, good stuff. Just some more thoughts on one thing. The melancholic individual. I mean, again, it's kind of the same as with the hypnosis, It might just be that it's its own thing and completely unrelated, but one thing that even made it into mainstream reporting and documentary making and stuff is that in many different cultures all around the world, especially, of course, traditional ones where there is like a shamanic practice or like a priest class or witch doctors, whatever. It's not uncommon for people who have some kind of a mental affliction that involves, some of the more extreme, like delusions, hallucinations, and so on, for them to be picked up by spiritual teachers in their community, and that they, with their guidance, actually end up being very valuable, like spiritual workers, again, within whatever culture or system that is. And yeah, I've actually seen many reports on this happening from the Americas through Europe and even in the East, So that's kind of an interesting thing maybe to consider when he mentions this. Perhaps it is that conventional wisdom of the time.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's a really weird... So Agrippa has this recurring pattern in all three of the books where he will have like this really structured, really well thought out through line of logic where it's like you go from occult virtues to the planets and how they affect virtues, and then everything is virtues filtered through the planets. And then he will just start talking about very bizarre things at the end of the book, basically like trying to fill in the rest of it because he doesn't know where to put it. And he doesn't like preface it. He just starts talking about like, yeah, here's the depressed people. The depressed people are good at divining things. Or the melancholic individuals, as he says. But usually people in modern day will think melancholic equals depressed. Like, it's such a bizarre section that I just needed to mention it. There's also I did skip the how to raise the dead section because, like, I don't know what to make of some of the things he puts here, because he does have like a section where he's like, how we know these things are credible, and he then proceeds to put, because it was written in a book.
The most reasonable approach to necromancy I've heard is basically, summoning spirits, except it's spirits of deceased people. Is that what goes on in that part, or is it far weirder?
No, he's talking about waking them up. Like, he's talking about they're dead, wake them up. Like, oh no, I'm sorry, I was dead? Oh no. Like, that's why it's in the section on sleep. He quite literally means, like, yeah, just wake them up. Like, what are you doing? It's like, Jesus did it, you can do it. Remember when Jesus did the Lazarus thing? He, like, woke up Lazarus. He was just sleeping. It's fine, just do that. Yeah, it's really weird sections like that just exist in Agrippa, because, like, for every good thing Agrippa has, he also has an equal amount of insane nonsense or old science that has been refuted.
Of course, Agrippa is perhaps also the father of, spell jars, or whatever people call those, honey jars, the jars you put stuff into, which is cool. But also, there was a warning in there somewhere, maybe it was from Agrippa, maybe it was from you, that, the virtue thing, if you combine certain ingredients and they have bad qualities, well, you're going to end up with those bad qualities in your mixture. So you need to choose your ingredients very carefully if you don't want to suffer any of those negative consequences.
The correspondences are going to be unique for, one, each individual specimen, and two, they're going to be unique for each individual species. So theoretically, you can make a solar or a martial correspondent tincture, or spell jar, as it were, and you can make this, and if you've messed up the properties of one of your things, you can make the entire blend wrong. So hypothetically, you go ahead and you make a incense that you've filled with solar things, and then you find out that one of the incenses you've used is actually used in funerary rites. Well, all of a sudden, you have just found out that you've added a Saturnian influence to your primarily solar incense blend, and that can actually cause problems because the Sun and Saturn, they're very antagonistic towards each other.
So we're kind of closing up here. Let's give Dave a round of applause, emojis, cheers, whatever. Anything that works for you. Thank you so much, Dave, for the awesome presentation. Yes, so don't forget, folks, Dave is actively creating all sorts of useful material for practicing occultists. Yeah, is there anything you want to say about that, Dave?
For the most part, I'm talking about occultism from a mechanical first perspective when I'm talking about occultism. For example, I have some videos where I go over the books. I have a video about the Arbitel, and I'm going to be finishing a series that I realize I didn't finish about the Lesser Key of Solomon. That's going to be coming up soon. So, like, I talk about spiritual best practices and all that kind of stuff. So if you're looking for magic from a more mechanical perspective, that's what my channel is for. Because I think there's a lot better people to be talking about the historical basis than I am.
Yeah, awesome. And your channel, again, I mean, we're seeing it on the screen, but could you say it out loud again? Where do we find it?
Yep, I am Dave. My channel is Amateur Magus. That's where you can find me.
Well, that's it. Thanks again, Dave. One more round of applause, folks, and emojis. Thank you very much for the presentation, and see you next time. Make sure to join our Discord if you're not on there yet. The invite code is just VRM, so that's very easy to join in there, and also in this world, and also on the Google Calendar you can find when our next events will be. So yeah, if you enjoy the experience at VR Mystery School, you would like to support the development of new features, worlds, more events and things like that, perhaps consider becoming a supporter. Would be very welcome. We'll be going into the lounge for a little get together for anybody that's interested. If you're not sticking around, thanks for coming, and see you next time.